Welcome back to Facing South Florida. I'm Rick Folbaum. My next guest is Dr. Frank Mora, a former political appointee of President Barack Obama, currently a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. Dr. Mora, thank you very much for talking to us today. I want to start with Venezuela, which seems to be spiraling more and more out of control with every given day. As you look at that crisis, what is most alarming to you?
I think we've reached a point of no return. I think this is out of the control of everyone in the opposition, the government, and there are no potential scenarios that you could imagine and predict where this is going. This is literally an out of control situation.
What can the United States do in terms of trying to bring about some stability there?
Limited options. The truth of the matter is that the United States, other than sanctioning and punishing government or government officials, there's very little it can do, other than, I would add, working with Venezuela's neighbors to put diplomatic pressure. It's one thing if it's just the United States pressuring, but if it's the international community truly bringing to bear pressure on the Venezuelan government, that could change the dynamic in some positive ways in Venezuela. But the unfortunate reality is that we're going to see more violence in the streets of Venezuela. More people are going to die. And what we're seeing is a humanitarian disaster that is beginning to spill across Venezuela's borders into Brazil and into Colombia. So it's not just a Venezuela problem, it's very much a regional problem.
Well, given that, it's beginning to sort of, again, as you said, spill over into other neighboring countries. It seems like there is a huge urgency here on the part of the United States to try to do something to contain it before other countries, other leaders begin to sort of follow the same kinds of tactics as Maduro.
Yeah, but again, Rick, what are those options? What are those things? I don't think anyone is suggesting a military intervention. I don't think anyone's suggesting sanctioning the country of Venezuela. So what's left?
Sanctioning individuals, that's something.
Individuals is something. But we have to, Rick, moderate our expectations about what those kinds of sanctions will do, because I don't think we should not expect that Maduro and company are going to adjust their behavior just because the United States has put them on a blacklist, right? It makes us feel good. I think it's symbolically powerful in the message it sends to Venezuelans and to the neighbors, but we shouldn't expect that the sanction is going to result in something positive. Quite the contrary. What the regime will do is hunker down because they realize now that they're in a life and death situation.
So when people talk about an oil embargo as a way of trying to, really hurt the Maduro government, you think that it's the people of Venezuela who will be most hurt by something like that?
I think so, that other than targeted sanctions against individuals or against institutions tied to the government, going beyond that will be counterproductive, both politically and economically, and I would not recommend such a measure.
We have so many Venezuelans here in South Florida. This is a part of the world that a lot of them who have been fortunate enough to get out of Venezuela in the last couple of years have decided to try to come to South Florida to make homes for themselves. In Weston, for example, big Venezuelan community there, and other parts of town as well. What would you say to Venezuelans who are now here in the U.S., who may have family still back at home, as they watch this unfold? What words would you have for them?
Well, I mean, words of encouragement, because what's important, what we saw in Venezuela that unfortunately we didn't see in the Cuban Revolution and years after, is that the Venezuelans are out in the street, right? They're occupying spaces in Caracas and other cities and pushing the government further into a corner, leaving it with very few options other than repression. And the more that the regime has to use repression, the weaker it gets. And I think, as I said, it's unfortunate because I'm afraid more people will die. I think adding or continuing or supporting that kind of effort on the part of the Venezuelan opposition is something that is indispensable if change is to come to the country.
You are a former worker at the Pentagon. You worked there during the Obama administration. You worked there at the same time as General John Kelly, who is the new chief of staff at the White House. One thing that General Kelly has not been able to do yet is to plug the leaks, and that is something that this White House is very, very concerned about. And again, at the end of the week, the big story out of the Washington Post were these transcripts of phone conversations that took place months ago, right after the president's inauguration, between the president and the leaders of Mexico and Australia. And it really gives a window, if you read the exchanges that the president was having with these other world leaders, gives you a window into the way that he goes about foreign policy, the way that he goes about trying to create a playing field where he could negotiate a better deal for the United States, which of course is something that he campaigned on. It also gave us a window into his expectations when it comes to building the famous wall on our southern border with Mexico. What jumped out at you when you read those transcripts, and again, sort of keeping in mind your expertise in politics and international relations?
Well, I would recommend your viewers to read the transcripts very carefully because, as you said, it's very revealing. The one thing that I thought was very revealing is that he admitted to the president of Mexico that this whole wall issue was a political issue, that he wasn't really committed. This was not going to be part of the bilateral relations. But please, President of Mexico, don't say that you're not going to pay for it because it hurts me politically. So the cynicism in all this is really astounding to me, and now it's in black and white. It's in the transcripts in his conversation with the Mexican president that he is not really serious about the wall, but he used it as a political campaign issue to promote his candidacy when he's really not committed, or at least that's what he said on the phone to the Mexican president.
Final question. Every president has his own style, his own way of doing things. Obviously, President Trump's style is different from anyone we've seen before him. I'm just wondering, from an international relations standpoint, is there anything about this president's style and his MO that could serve him and serve our country well?
Well, Rick, that's a very important question because he says that he is unpredictable and he likes to be unpredictable. That is the worst thing that you could do in an international system, a system that is full of uncertainties. And what you need to do to bring to your allies and even to your adversary a sort of sober, clear vision of what you want to do. Not share secrets, but a clear vision of where you stand on issues. If you create more or you insert more uncertainty in the system begins to unravel. That, to me, in my opinion, is the most dangerous thing that I have seen in this administration. Is sort of the view that we're going to wing it, we're going to attack our friends, embrace some of our adversaries, and create uncertainty in the system. In part, that's what makes Iran and North Korea much more complicated.
Dr. Frank Mora, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insight. Nice to meet you too. And we'll be right back.